Everyone wants to leave a legacy, but we all don't know how, or we're not willing to pay the price. Today we look at Luke chapter 14, and we're going to talk about the cost of building a legacy. Let's check it out.
Hey, today we're continuing on in our series, Marriage, Money, and Minions, and we're wrapping up kind of this second topic of this money. And nothing says exciting sermon like talking about an estate plan, right? I know you're riveted. You saw that video, you're like, wow, this is gonna be a burner today. Like, I'm so excited. And I know you hear that and you're like, really? Like estate planning? Like that's something like you do right before you die. No, you do it way before you die, so you're ready when you die one day. But today, as we kind of talk about this topic of money, and we talk about estate planning, that in part of that, I want to invite you tonight, and we'll kind of come back to it at the end, is at our surprise campus at 5 o'clock. Dr. Jarbo, who's in that video, is actually putting on a seminar that goes through this, talking about wills and trusts and all these words that feel like dirty words. And you're like, I don't even have money to give away when I die. But you might have more than you think. And you might have something that you want to be planful, that how are we empowering our family? How are we putting into our neighborhoods and our communities? But you hear all that and you're like, that doesn't sound exciting. That doesn't sound fun. But you see, our money is just a little bit of a window into our hearts. And today, as we kind of go through this and we talk about this idea of leaving a legacy behind, money's just a really, really small fraction of that. But when we talk about a legacy, when we talk about building something that goes past us, that impacts our family members, impacts our neighbors, impacts our workplaces, our churches, our communities, that it really requires some thinking and some actions on our side. Here's kind of a truth I want us to start out with, and a little bit of a reality check as we kind of dive into this topic today and thinking about this. This is a reality in life that everyone wants to leave a legacy, but not everyone realizes it requires some intentionality, right? Nobody goes into life and says like, I just want to survive another day and then one day die and I'm good. If that's your mindset, that's super depressing, and let's go get coffee after and try to shake you a little bit, okay? But nobody has like the bar set all the way down here. Be like, I want to achieve something great. I want to pass on something awesome, but we maybe either don't know how to do it or we don't have the drive to get there. This past week, we got to do some fun things at church, and Scott mentioned a little bit on Tuesday night, we had our second prayer summit that we've been doing monthly. And fast forward just a little bit, tell you is we're gonna do another prayer summit on Good Friday. So 4/7, you can mark that on your calendar. We're gonna be doing that outside. That's gonna be fun and crazy. But we had our prayer summit. And in that time, we just got to pray and we got to worship. And part of that process is we're planting spiritual seed. We're planting seeds in our life and among our church family that all of a sudden don't sprout right away. All of a sudden we don't see the results right away. A lot of times we don't pray often enough because we pray for something and then we wait a day, we're like, God, you didn't answer my prayer. It's like, you gotta give it a little more time. Maybe he is answering your prayer, but he's shaping your mentality rather than just answering it like a genie. And then yesterday, we actually had a garden planting day. It was super fun. I actually brought my 6-year-old and my 4-year-old, and I'm like, hey, well, I'll get you donuts, but first we gotta go plant some seed, and we gotta go to the garden. And it was so fun. Miss Karen, who oversees and really runs our garden, she took them all around. They watered plants, they pulled weeds, they put seed in the ground, they pruned other plants. And you see, a lot of times we wanna plant something, but we just hope it's instantaneous results, instead of realizing there's a lot of work that goes into it. There's a lot of that watering. There's a lot of that pruning. And it seems like if you know about gardening, it's just pulling weeds all the time. Anyone's yard, have you sprayed your yard 50 times? I don't know, I have. I'm like, I just sprayed all of this and this dang wind just blew it all back in here and my yard looks like, I haven't attended to it for a while again. But you see, our lives are not much different. We want to build towards something. We want to create something great in our life. We want to achieve something. We want to look at something like we're proud of, that we can pass on to our kids, that we can make our parents proud of, that we can show our community and our neighbors. But maybe we just don't know how to do it. And maybe we don't know how to start that process. Well, here's the good news. Is even in the practical things like this, is Jesus doesn't just leave us in the dark. He actually has some words of wisdom that we can attempt to apply in our lives today. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip to Luke chapter 14. And in Luke chapter 14, we're gonna see a little bit, and we're gonna see what does having a legacy require of us? What is legacy living, if you will? What does it require us to do in our lives? Because let me tell you, it doesn't require you to do nothing. It doesn't require you to do the same things you've always done to get the same result you always have. It requires us to shake up our lives a little bit if we're not on course with God. It requires us to think critically and correct things when they get off track. And in Luke chapter 14, starting in verse 25, we're gonna see three things that this type of living requires us to do. So I just wanna read this whole passage right now, and then we'll spend some time kind of breaking down. And it starts here in Luke 14, verse 25, it says, "Now great crowds were traveling with him," being Jesus. And so he turned and he said to them, and I love this, Jesus always builds these big crowds, and more people, they saw him perform miracles. They saw him be like a free meal ticket and make more food. So like, we gotta follow that guy. And anytime the crowd got too big, he just dropped some truth bomb on them, and they're like, yeah, I don't wanna follow that dude no more. And this is where he's starting to weed some people out. Verse 26, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you wanting to build a tower doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, after he has laid the foundation and he cannot finish it, all the onlookers will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This man started to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or what king going to war against another king will not first sit down and decide if he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If not, while the other is still far off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. In the same way, therefore, every one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple." Dear Lord, I thank you this morning. God, I thank you that as we dive into your word, Lord, as we just read, you tell us that your word is profitable for truth. And God, as we read your word, my prayer is that it's like a cutting edge, that it cuts the sin away from our heart. God, that it cuts the things away from our life that we focus on that don't matter. And God, we can use this time to realign back to your will. God, if there are things in our lives that are keeping us from living the life that points towards you, that lives a legacy in your kingdom, God, I ask that you convict us of it. God, I ask that you make it clear to us. And Lord, that we can leave here renewed in you maybe for the first time or again. And God, we can live on mission for you. God, I lift all this up. In Jesus' name, amen. As we dive into this and we talk about what is living or legacy living, what does it require of us? I think the first thing it requires us to do is give up control of my life. Check out verse 26 again. And like I said, I love how Jesus does this. Every time the crowd gets too big, he's like, all right, we got to start shaping out the posers. And like the guys who are just here for the free meal ticket, or the guys who are just here that are kind of hanging around, he's like, you're out. And let's see who's really devoted to this. In verse 26, talk about a strong entry. "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters." Now some of you hear that and you're like, I got all those down, right? He's not saying what you think he's saying, okay? It's not quite like that. Then he goes a little bit deeper. "Yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Now, when we read this today, we think that sounds like super harsh. Did Jesus literally just say that you need to hate your family members in order to be his disciple? Because I think that's the opposite of what I know about Jesus. Everything Jesus says is love God and love others. That's how you literally sum up the entire ministry of what Jesus says. He said you can complete the entire law by loving God and loving others. And then he says, now you need to hate your family and all your friends and even yourself if you want to be my disciple. And we hear that and we're like, dude, what? That sounds like counter. And critics would even look at this passage and be like, see, the Bible contradicts itself. Even Jesus contradicts himself. He says something that's totally opposite of what he says in other places. But we need to break this down a little bit. And then actually some of the reason for this is there's probably not a good word from the Greek language to the English language to say exactly the heart of this feeling. You see, this idea of hate isn't exactly the same as how we would see hate. When we hear the word hate, we think of we despise someone, we want to remove someone from our lives. And Jesus is not at all saying this. Actually, a more proper kind of translation of this would be to love less. So what Jesus is saying, if you do not love your family less than you love me, you cannot be my disciple. My son Archie and Aria and my daughter, we've started to teach them this early. We're you love God the most. And sometimes Archie will go off on these rants. He's 4 years old and be like, I love this. He's like, I love you better than this. And we're like, hey, okay, let's not be mean and let's not do a ranking system. But where do I stack up against mom? We put him to bed and he told mom that he loved her more than a cactus. And I was like, not sure that's a great compliment, dude. Cactuses are super pokey. But then he told me he loves me more than a T-Rex, which he loves dinosaurs, so that was a huge compliment. So I was like, point dad, right? No. But he will tell us straight up, Dad, I love you, but I love God more. I'm like, you're right, buddy. He's like, I love God better than I love you. I'm like, well, work on your grammar, but that's correct. And you have the right mindset. And this is exactly what Jesus is saying, is who do we love the most? And because as this kind of peels out, and Jesus gets to this at the very end of this passage, but kind of also to reiterate this and some of why they use hate in this English translation, is it also means to renounce or to leave aside. And what Jesus was saying is that when we love God more than all of our other relationships, we are literally putting him as the utmost priority in our life so that when other things interfere with that priority, they do not win out. And we said, no, God is first in my life. And if it conflicts with that, we are called to lay it aside, to renounce it, to walk away from it and continue to hold God as the utmost spot. When we hear this, I think it's something that we convict ourselves with, and I think we need to ask ourselves, do we have any relationships in our lives that are holding back our relationship with God? You see, this is a really tough balance. And I tell people this all the time. Let me just talk into the church as a whole. As the church, we should have friends and family members and people in our lives who do not know Jesus, that we should be praying for, that we should be loving, that we should be telling about Jesus constantly. And the worst thing that can happen to a church is a church becomes so insulated that the only people they know is Christians because they are not fulfilling the Great Commission at that point. And it's hard because sometimes you have to get out of your comfort zone. You look at the New Testament, probably most of their friends were saved at some point, but then they went and they made new friends who didn't know Jesus and they told them about Jesus. But here's where the balance comes. Is sometimes there are friends in your life that you pray for, that you love, but if they're dragging you down to their level, sometimes you gotta lay them aside. And when someone is constantly, it's like, hey, this isn't just something that I love you and I'm ministering to you and my relationship's holding with God, but every time we gotta hang out, we gotta go get wasted, or we gotta go do this, or we gotta go fall into this old sinful lifestyle that I know is wrong, and God's saying you need to put that aside. And you need to put me as a priority. And here when we do that, what Jesus is telling us in this passage is we're letting go of control of our lives. We're saying, I no longer get to make my own decisions. I no longer get to make my decisions in a vacuum, but I lay it at the feet of Christ. I get to say, hey, what you say is most important, God, that is what I'm gonna do. If I have to break off some relationships or I have to just put some space and some boundaries in those in order to follow your will, it's what I have to do. When this happens and we come face to face with this reality, I think this can be so tough for us. Because sometimes it means saying no to people we really love and we care about, but saying, hey, I just can't go down that path anymore. But not only Jesus tell us here that sometimes we have to let go, we have to let control of our life, but we also need to let go of the resources we have, let go of my resources both today and tomorrow. Let's keep reading in verse 28. And then Jesus here goes into an example, and he kind of gives a little illustration here. And he says this in 28, for which of you, wanting to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, after he has laid the foundation and he cannot finish it, all the onlookers will begin to ridicule him, saying, this man started to build and wasn't able to finish. I love the illustration that Jesus gives here, is he talks about a principle of planning and budgeting. Now, let me tell you, I told you today was going to be exciting. We started out, we were saying we're going to talk about estate planning. What's more fun than planning and budgeting, all right? You guys have never budgeted before, that's what I heard. Anyone ever had a family budget meeting? Yeah, they're terrible if you've ever had them. And if you have, it's only because Dave Ramsey probably made you, okay? But nobody likes to budget. Nobody likes to plan out and say like, hey, let's like to be really succinct and careful here. And let's make sure we have enough money and go for this and go for this and go for this. Because that's not how we're trained. We're trained to scroll social media or watch something on TV and say, I need that. As soon as the Suns traded for Kevin Durant, I started plotting when I could convince my wife I could buy a KD jersey, okay? And I already have like 5 Devin Booker jerseys, so I knew it was going to be a while. I was like, I think they have to win the finals, and then I can get one with the finals patch. Wes knows what I'm talking about. And then I can justify it. But you see, in our lives, we don't like to sit back and we don't like to plan and to budget because it's just really not fun. But here's the entire point of this. As Jesus gives us a kind of a little caveat on top of this, is he's saying planning and budgeting. The reason we did this wasn't to be less fun. The reason we did it wasn't to take the killjoy out of spending money. But he said the reason was to build up enough money to spend it on something great. You see, think of the illustration he gives here, is that this guy wasn't just saving up some money to build a house. He was gonna build a tower. Something that just wouldn't go away, probably wouldn't even go away when he died, but he was gonna build something that would leave a legacy that other people would see for generations to come. And what Jesus gives us here is this little concept and kind of this idea in planning here is that our money shouldn't be wasted. We shouldn't just spend it frivolously, but also our money shouldn't be hoarded. That when we do save money, when we do invest it wisely, when we do put money in the bank and we budget and live in our means and we don't live above that money accumulates, but it ultimately accumulates for God's purposes. We spend it on things that are not just temporal, that are not just for us, that are just not in our echo chamber, but we spend it on eternal things. Last week, we previewed a couple of things we're doing here at Cross Church of how are we going to invest just beyond our church into some very intentional, eternal things. And for 3 times a year, we said we're gonna take special offerings where we're gonna challenge ourselves and challenge our church family of how can we give above and beyond our normal generosity. And I'll tell you, this is hard for me personally because I am a tight-wad person, okay? I know how much money I have to give, and then I'm not usually generous after that. I'm like, this is the money I'm giving. I'm generous here, but I'm not like a spontaneous generous person, right? I'm like, I got a plan for that generosity. But we said 3 times a year, we're gonna do special funds of giving. The first one is we're going to give, and we're gonna talk about that in just a couple weeks, is we're gonna give 100% to support church planning, of starting more churches in the United States and in our city and around, of getting more churches that are started and sharing the gospel in our world. The next one we're gonna do in probably about midsummer or kind of later August is we're gonna take a church rescue. Is we're gonna take an offering that's gonna go to churches who are kind of dying, who have been on their last legs, similar to how we were before we took over. This church was an empty building. Is how do we breathe life into that? And be another light in that community. And lastly, around Christmas time, we're going to have an offering that's going to be about international missions and international church. That all that money is literally going to go around our world to help missionaries and help international churches be able to share the love of Christ. And that next one we're about to do, the one coming up in church planning, is throughout all of April, we're going to raise money for this. But here's when we give money like this, and this isn't the only way we invest eternally, but we start investing in something that doesn't build up our own kingdom, that doesn't make us feel great, that we might not see the rewards from, we might not see the fruit bear of, but God's kingdom does. And here, Jesus is challenging us. He's like, sit down, weigh it. He's like, what resources do you have? And then he says, just now keep it all in the bank, because it's not safe there. I'm just kidding. There's a bank that failed in Silicon Valley. It's been a crazy week, so go look that up. It's fun. Also, crypto's dying. There's nowhere safe to put your money. We're all right when we put it under a mattress like 50 years ago. That's the safest place, right? I'm just kidding. I'm not a financial advisor. Don't go take that as your clip for the day. But Jesus is telling us, don't just hoard this money, don't just put it away, but save it responsibly, but so that we can do something amazing with it. And here he kind of shows us that we are to let go of those resources, that that's not something we just build our kingdom with, but we spend it for something that God has for us, knowing that he has a plan with it. Which leads to our last point of what legacy living requires of us to do. And the last thing is it requires me to passionately offer my skills, talents, and abilities. Check out verse 31. And he says this, or what king going to war against another king will not first sit down and decide if he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If not, while the other is still far off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. Verse 33. In the same way, therefore, every one of you who does not renounce, see that similar word there that we talked about earlier, all his possessions cannot be my disciple. Jesus closes out this section. He kind of uses this as like, if he's giving a little short kind of talk to weed out the crowd, right? This is almost like his concluding sentence. He's like, in case you didn't get it by all my illustrations, this is what I'm saying. He's saying that this is going to cost you everything. He's like, so if you're here for the miracles, if you're here for the free food, if you're here for this, he's like, let me just tell you, following me is going to cost you your entire life and everything you own. And that's where the guys were like, all right, that's what I need to hear. I'm out of here. Bye, see you. They're like, you ain't giving out more miracles today? All right, I'm out of here. But Jesus makes very clear, and actually, if you, in most of our Bibles, the section of this, like there will be a section heading, which isn't in the original like language, we kind of add those later to kind of organize it. But the section heading is called the cost of following Jesus. And here's the cost. The cost is giving up control of our lives. The cost is letting go of our resources, even when we just want to spend them on ourselves. And most importantly, the cost is offering our skills, our talents, and our abilities. You see, we don't just fall in to building a legacy. We don't just fall into like having this legacy lifestyle. It doesn't happen by accident. Like you're not gonna wake up one day and just like being lazy or just doing the bare minimum, and then all of a sudden you'd be like, man, I've accomplished so much. Wouldn't it be great if life worked that way? I would love that. Like you just watch Netflix all day long and you wake up and you're like, man, my kids raised themselves. This is awesome, right? If only Disney Plus could do it all. But anyway, but it's like we can only do so much. It doesn't happen by accident. Instead, it happens by intentionality. You know, I love one of the things that I got my major in my undergrad in business management before I went to seminary. And one of the things that I love is I can watch Shark Tank like all day long, okay? And if you've ever seen the show Shark Tank, you know, they come in, they pitch their product, and some of them are really dumb, but some of them are great. But I love hearing the stories behind the entrepreneur and the sacrifices they made and all that they went through to build this thing in their life. And sometimes you're like, that's a terrible idea. But it was like something they poured their entire life into. And for us, when we talk about building a legacy, when we talk about our life pointing towards something, it doesn't happen by just falling into it. It happens by pouring our lives and our hearts and our energy and our resources into it. And when we start to live this way, here is what is so awesome. And this is kind of our key thought that we'll use to wrap this up today. And if you don't kind of get anything from it, is why we do this is when we start to live lives of legacy. When we start legacy living, it is naturally going to lead to legacy giving. Here's the thing, is if you start to live your life disciplined in a way where like, I'm gonna give it up. It's not about me. It's gonna be about God. It's gonna be about Christ. It's gonna be about doing things for Jesus. He is going to take your heart, even if you're like Scrooge McDuck and you're just tight with your money, that you're not generous in person, and he will naturally make you a more generous person. He will naturally start to break down the things in your life that you see, and when you just, I'm gonna hoard, I'm gonna keep, I'm gonna scratch everything I can to spend on myself, he will start to shape and he will start to change how we view our world. Recently, there's been studies that have shown that as you invest into like a country, and as kind of the minimum GDP, I know this sermon is just really doing it for you, right? We talked about that, and then GDP. So the average amount that someone makes, if you get it over something like $5,000, that the mindset in a person starts to change. And they start moving from, I want to survive tomorrow, I want to survive till tomorrow, I want to make it through the day, to start thinking is, I want to make a better world for the people around me. And we live in a country where, if we're honest, 99% of the time, we have our basic needs met. You know where you're gonna sleep. You know what you're gonna eat. Sometimes you have too many options. You don't know what you're gonna eat because you can't decide. We know what we're gonna do kind of the rest of the week. But then we start to shift and think about, but what is my future going to hold? And you see, when we start to step into that, we start to ask ourselves is, how can I do things that are not just gonna build my kingdom here, but are gonna build God's kingdom for eternity? Here's a couple things I wanna challenge you with today. And you're like, how do I take this? Like, what is my next step? How do I go further than this? And the first question, and you can think about this, maybe you can write this down or take notes in here, is the first thing I want you to ask yourself is, what do I need to change about my life today to achieve what I want to tomorrow? Maybe there's some rhythms in your life that are just selfish, that are sinful, that you know are not right, and you indulge yourself in this, and it takes your money, it takes your time, it takes your energy, and it takes maybe your morality, and you're like, I just gotta get rid of that if I'm ever gonna be the person that God wants me to be. What do you need to let go of today in order to become the person God has for you tomorrow? And the second one that kind of goes with that is, how can I leave behind a legacy? Maybe for you, you kind of have been on that path, but you don't know what the next step is. Maybe today you need to go and go to a trust building seminar, as exciting as that sounds, right? And you need to think of, hey, what are the steps I need to take to build something that lasts, to build something that goes beyond me? And church, the reason that we can do this, the reason we can even start to think about these things, is because just as we read during our worship, that Jesus stepped down for us so that we could have a new legacy. So that no longer would we be identified by our sin, no longer would we be identified by our mistakes, by the ways we screwed up, but Jesus came, he lived here, he died on a cross, he raised again so that we could have a new life. We could have a new purpose in him. We could stop focusing on building our own kingdoms and start focusing on investing and building his.